over a dozen samples of Bigfoot hair collected in 4 states of the United States. They all agree in structure with each other in terms of diameter, color, pigment distribution, lack of a medulla, and lack of banding or tapering.
They developed AI capable of detecting a deepfake from a single frame buried within millions of hours of video. Then, they aimed it at the most well-known Bigfoot footage ever recorded. 100 years of film, audio tapes, footprint casts, and thousands of eyewitness accounts led to that moment. The technology was meant to settle the argument once and for all. It didn't. What it uncovered only made the mystery deeper. A century of something in the woods. This story doesn't begin with film. It begins with a siege. July 1924. 5 gold prospectors were camped near a narrow gorge on the southeastern slope of Mount St. Helens in Washington state. Fred Beck, Marion Smith, his son Roy, Gabe Lefevre, and John Peterson had been working a claim known as the Vanderwhite for weeks. For days, they found enormous footprints near their camp, tracks too large to belong to any animal they recognized. Then one afternoon, Beck and Smith saw a figure standing near the tree line across a small canyon. It was upright, covered in dark hair, roughly 7 feet tall. Smith lifted his rifle and fired 3 shots. The figure lurched and vanished over a cliff into the ravine below. That night, the men crowded inside their small log cabin as something far worse unfolded. Multiple creatures, they said, surrounded the structure and began pelting it with boulders. The strikes came in waves, stones smashing into timber, sharp and explosive, echoing through the canyon like gunfire. Something heavy climbed onto the roof, and the entire cabin trembled under its weight. Something tried to force the door. According to Beck's account, a massive arm pushed through one of the windows and reached for an axe left on the table. The 5 men fired rifles and revolvers through the walls into darkness so complete they couldn't see their target. They could only hear it, scraping across the roof, grunts beyond the walls, the relentless crack of rock against wood. It lasted for hours. When morning finally came, they grabbed only what they could carry and fled the Vanderwhite mine. None of them ever returned. Newspapers ran headlines. Mountain devils bombard prospector's cabin. Fight with big apes reported by miners. The U.S. Forest Service investigated, found no clear evidence, and concluded the miners had likely staged the scene. The story should have unraveled. It didn't. Fred Beck never withdrew his claim. Decades later, he published a detailed account titled, "I Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens." None of the 5 miners ever altered their stories. In 2013, land surveyor Mark MCEL rediscovered the long-lost cabin site nearly 90 years later. Among the remains, he found tools and spent rifle casings, positioned in ways that matched Beck's description. When pattern analysis software cross-referenced the original 1924 newspaper reports, Beck's later writings, and Mersel's archaeological findings, the outcome was striking. The central details remained stable across sources separated by almost a century. The account didn't grow more dramatic over time. It didn't shift. For a fabricated story, that level of consistency is statistically rare. But what AI found consistent in the Ape Canyon accounts was minor compared to what it uncovered in the audio evidence. Something it couldn't classify at all. The sounds that defy explanation. 47 years later, nearly 600 miles to the south, another event unfolded that would defy explanation for decades. In 1971, Ron Moorhead, a California businessman, was invited to a remote deer hunting camp high in the Sierra Nevada, deep in the wilderness between Lake Tahoe and Yosemite. Hunters there had reported massive footprints and strange nighttime calls echoing from the ridgelines. One member of the group refused to return. Moorhead took his place. The first night he heard it, there was no buildup. The camp sat in a granite basin at high elevation, the kind of place where silence is absolute and every sound carries for miles. Moorhead stood near the shelter when the ridge above them exploded with noise. It wasn't a howl. It wasn't a scream. It struck the chest before the ears could interpret it. Deep, resonant, impossibly loud, reverberating off the rock walls like a physical force. Then another voice answered from a separate ridge, then a third. The hunters looked at each other in silence. Every man there knew those mountains. None had heard anything like that. What Moorhead and investigative journalist Al Berry recorded over the following years became known as the Sierra Sounds. They remain some of the most unsettling audio recordings in cryptozoological history. The tapes captured guttural roars, sharp bird-like whistles, and then something even stranger, rapid, rhythmic vocal bursts with an almost structured cadence. Researchers later called it samurai chatter because of its aggressive, patterned quality. Berry had arrived as a skeptic, sent by the Sacramento Bee to expose a fraud. Instead, he experienced the sounds himself and spent years pushing for professional analysis. Until his death in 2012, he insisted the recordings were authentic. Retired U.S. Navy cryptographic linguist R. Scott Nelson studied the tapes and delivered a conclusion that unsettled many. He stated the vocalizations showed FMIC structures consistent with language, recognizable patterns of consonants, vowels, and tonal shifts. His verdict was direct. The sounds represented language, not human, and not fabricated. No peer-reviewed study has formally confirmed that conclusion. Critics argue the noises could be human imitation, known wildlife, or acoustic distortion amplified by mountain terrain. Yet, spectrographic analysis mapping frequency and amplitude reveals anomalies that resist easy dismissal. Some vocal bursts exceed normal human vocal range. Others contain harmonic overtones rarely found in documented North American wildlife. When AI voice identification systems trained on extensive databases of human and animal sounds processed the recordings, they returned no match. The audio fell outside every recognized category. The Sierra site was revisited in 1972 and again in 1974. Each time, the vocalizations returned. Whatever produced those sounds came back to the same ridges year after year. Something was there, it communicated, and it left nothing visible behind. The next piece of evidence would not be sound. It would be physical, pressed 3 inches deep into the earth. The figure in the mud. In September 2000, a team from the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization traveled to Skookum Meadows in Washington's Gifford-Pinchot National Forest near Mount Adams, while filming for the Australian TV series Animal X. Their plan was simple: leave piles of fruit in a muddy clearing as bait and return at first light. At dawn on September 22nd, they hiked back in. The first thing they noticed was the bait. Several apples were missing. Then someone looked down. The mud beside the fruit had been altered overnight, not by a footprint, but by something far larger. A massive body impression stretched across the soft ground. The outline was distinct: a forearm, a hip, a thigh curving into a buttock, and a heel pressed deep enough to suggest the ridge of an Achilles tendon. The researchers fell silent. The proportions were immediately off. This wasn't a track. Something large had lain on its side in the mud and reached toward the fruit. The team poured more than 200 pounds of plaster to preserve it. The resulting Skookum cast measured roughly 3.5 by 5 feet and weighed close to 400 pounds. Impressions resembling hair were visible along the thigh and buttock. Dr. Jeff Meldrum of Idaho State University reported what appeared to be dermal ridges in the heel area, structures comparable to primate fingerprints. Physical anthropologist Grover Krantz, wildlife biologist John Bindernagel, and Meldrum each examined the cast and pointed to features they believed did not match known wildlife. Then came the pushback. Journalist Mark Hume, writing for Canada's National Post, observed clear elk tracks within the impression. Hair samples were identified as elk. Skeptic Blake Smith, writing for Skeptoid, argued the team, working under pressure to capture compelling footage, may have misinterpreted a standard elk wallow as something extraordinary. Three-dimensional digital modeling later allowed analysts to study pressure distribution, estimating what body type, weight, and posture could have produced the shape in the mud. When compared against elk anatomy and theoretical primate models, The results refused to land decisively on either explanation. The impression contained elements of both. Neither account explained every feature. The Skookum cast did not confirm Bigfoot's existence, but it exposed weaknesses in the available explanations. Until then, every major incident had taken place in deep wilderness, remote canyons, mountain camps, forest clearings, far from the nearest human presence. The next event did not. It came to the door. May 2nd, 1971. Bobby Ford of Fouke, Arkansas, reported to the local constable that something attacked his house in the middle of the night. It began with a smell, a thick animal odor that filled the rooms before anyone saw anything. Elizabeth Ford was asleep on the living room couch when a heavy thud against the outside wall jolted her awake. It wasn't random noise. It sounded deliberate, like something probing the structure. Then the screen window bent inward, and a large, hair-covered arm forced its way through. For a split second, she thought it was a bear. It wasn't. She screamed. Bobby rushed outside and was grabbed by the creature. He tore free and ran back toward the house so fast he didn't even reach for the doorknob. He slammed straight through the front door. The family turned off the lights and huddled together while something circled the exterior walls. The stench lingered in the house for days. The account triggered a media frenzy. Southern State College archaeologist Frank Schambach examined the footprints and declared with 99% certainty that they were fabricated. The tracks had 3 toes, an anatomical structure impossible for any known primate. 3 locals were fined for filing false monster reports, but the sightings didn't stop. They continued for decades. In 1997 alone, more than 40 encounters were reported. Residents claimed the history stretched back to the 1940s. Before the Ford incident gained national attention, people had kept quiet, afraid of ridicule. In 1972, the docudrama The Legend of Boggy Creek, filmed on location in Fouke, became the 11th highest-grossing film of the year and helped shape the documentary horror style later echoed in the Blair Witch Project. When AI geographic clustering software maps the Fouke reports over time, a clear pattern appears. Sightings concentrate along a narrow corridor of bottomland hardwood swamp, tracing the Sulphur River. The distribution isn't random across Miller County. It follows the waterway, mirroring how a large, water-reliant animal would navigate fragmented terrain. Taken individually, each case can be disputed. Viewed together, a different pattern begins to emerge, one that only becomes visible when the entire dataset is analyzed at once. If you follow evidence wherever it leads, subscribe and turn on notifications, because when the machines processed all of it collectively, they produced a result neither skeptics nor believers were ready for. The pattern within the noise. When investigators plotted every examined Bigfoot report in the BFRO database onto one unified geographic grid, the points did not spread at random. They formed clusters, and those clusters appeared in areas that align with biological logic. The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization has maintained the largest screened database of sightings in North America since 1995. More than 4,000 reports, dating from the 1920s to today, each reviewed before being published. For years, it remained a collection of narratives. Then the dataset was processed through machine learning models, and what once looked like noise began to reveal a pattern. Clustering algorithms highlighted dense concentrations in the Pacific Northwest, the Ohio River Valley, Central Florida, and the Sierra Nevada. Washington State emerged as the strongest hotspot. These regions share common traits: extensive forest cover, reliable freshwater sources, sparse human density, and large stretches of uninterrupted wilderness. A study conducted through Idaho State University evaluated 19 geographic, climate, and demographic variables to estimate BFRO report frequency by state. The model accounted for more than 60% of the variation. The strongest environmental predictors were forest coverage and the number of clear weather days. Yet social factors also played a measurable role. The dataset carries 2 overlapping signals, one ecological, one cultural, and AI detected both. The reports follow the environmental footprint expected of a large forest-dwelling species. At the same time, They mirror patterns of human activity and reporting behavior. AI cannot disentangle those forces. It can only confirm that both patterns exist, and neither alone fully explains the distribution. The Patterson Gimlin Film, the Ape Canyon Siege, the Sierra Sounds, the Skookum cast, the Fouke monster, thousands of BFRO cases spanning a century. Each has been disputed, criticized, or dismissed on its own. But until recently, no one had combined all of it into a single analytical system and asked a machine to evaluate the entire century as one dataset. The result was not the clear resolution either skeptics or believers anticipated. What the machines discovered. When artificial intelligence processes the full body of evidence tied to the Bigfoot phenomenon, film, audio, physical impressions, and a century-long database, it doesn't issue a verdict. It returns a problem. October 20th, 1967. Two men on horseback round a bend along a creek in Northern California's Six Rivers National Forest. The horses rear. Ahead, a tall, dark, upright figure crosses a clearing. Roger Patterson jumps down, yanks a 16mm camera from his saddlebag, and runs. For 59 seconds, the camera records something no technology has fully accounted for. Then, at frame 352, the figure turns and looks directly into the lens. That backward glance became the most scrutinized image in cryptid history. It's where the AI began. For skeptics, the findings are uncomfortable. The Patterson Gimlin Film, stabilized with modern SIFT-based analysis by University of Washington researcher Isaac Tiong, reveals what appear to be muscle groups shifting beneath the surface: thigh, gluteal, and shoulder tissue moving independently from the outer layer with each step. In 1967, costume design lacked the sophistication to reproduce that effect. The gait shows compliant locomotion, a bent knee stride natural to great apes, but physically taxing for humans, especially inside a suit. The stride length averaged 41 inches. The head-to-body proportions align more closely with an adult gorilla than with a human. The Sierra Sounds contain vocalizations with harmonic structures that AI speaker recognition systems fail to match to any known species. The BFRO dataset clusters geographically in patterns consistent with ecological distribution rather than random cultural spread. For believers, the same AI findings are equally troubling. No single incident produces evidence that meets scientific standards of proof. The Skookum cast's hair samples tested as elk. The Ape Canyon site has a documented history of pranks. The Fouke monster left three-toed prints incompatible with primate anatomy. Every case contains weaknesses. Every piece of evidence allows an alternative explanation. AI doesn't dissolve this contradiction. It intensifies it across every domain: visual, acoustic, geographic, physical. The algorithms detect recurring anomalies, not isolated irregularities, but repeating patterns that surface independently across cases separated by decades and thousands of miles. In most scientific fields, that kind of pattern would prompt formal inquiry. Dr. Jeff Meldrum of Idaho State University spent decades analyzing the biomechanics of the Patterson Gimlin footage and related footprint casts. The compliant gait visible in the 1967 film corresponds with foot morphology found in prints gathered independently throughout the Pacific Northwest. The proportions remain internally consistent, not just within one artifact, but across evidence collected by different investigators in different states and different years. 7-time Academy Award winner Rick Baker reviewed the footage and described the fur as cheap-looking. Yet, when researchers tried to recreate the film's subject using materials available in 1967, every attempt failed. Not in one aspect, but in all simultaneously. The gait couldn't be replicated. The apparent muscle movement couldn't be fabricated. The proportions couldn't be matched. The same digital technologies capable of generating photorealistic humans from scratch cannot explain how a 59-second reel of 1967 film captured what it shows. Then there's the database. More than 4,000 reports separated by time, geography, and culture, submitted by individuals with no connection to one another. When AI processes these reports for movement descriptions, vocal traits, body proportions, habitat proximity to water, and behavioral patterns, the consistency exceeds what statistical models predict for independent invention. For a century, the accounts describe the same thing. That is the outcome. Not proof, not a debunking. A persistent pattern of data that should not exist, but does. No single person engineered that consistency. And when AI evaluated the phenomenon as one unified dataset, the signal grew stronger, not weaker, than any individual case alone suggested. The gap. There is a narrow space between what we can explain and what we can't. It isn't wide, but it endures, resisting every instrument we've created to close it. We've mapped the surface of Mars in sharper detail than parts of our own forests. We carry devices that can identify a bird from 2 seconds of its song. And when all that capability was directed at a century of Bigfoot evidence, every algorithm, every neural network, every forensic system, the machines delivered the same conclusion human investigators have reached since 1924. Not confirmation, not dismissal. Something in the data does not fit. Somewhere in the High Sierra, Ron Moorhead's recordings still crackle with sounds that remain unnamed. The gap is still there. The machines didn't resolve the mystery, they quantified it. Every individual piece of evidence can be explained. No single explanation accounts for all of it. That is the result. And that is what should keep you awake tonight. Subscribe if you want to see what happens when artificial intelligence examines other unsolved mysteries. This is just the start. The data doesn't care what you believe.